Hey everyone, I'm Patrick, and I'm going to give you some mix and production tips. So everyone's either met one or been this for a minute, you know, the DAW snob, and I've been there. I used to say X is best, but ultimately I cannot recommend anything more than diversifying your DAW knowledge, because you'll run into a session where someone comes in with a Logic session or an Ableton session or a Pro Tools session, and you just don't know what you're doing. So what I really recommend is to get over this hump, this idea that there's one DAW that's better than the next. You know, dabble around with a bit of everything and realize that all the tools are relatively similar, all of the processes are, you know, more or less the same, and to just move on from this elite mindset. So really diversify your knowledge and make yourself more of a Swiss Army knife in a session. Super simple tip. All you have to do is trust your instincts, because honestly, there's no wrong way to create. I don't know if you guys have heard of this, but there's like a really common disease that goes around in studios, and it's called Demo-itis. But the good news is there is a cure. If your artist falls in love with some sort of like tiny sound or a particular take that happened in a demo or in a pre-production session, you know, you really got to help people move past that and help them realize that the listener ultimately is not going to remember what the demo sounded like. So re-record it and really elevate the song with this new part, this new recording, and move on. Here's a tip. Get your mind out of the musical gutter and quit bashing on mainstream music, because it's not helping anyone except your ego. The reality is millions of people out there are listening to this music, and there's maybe something that you can learn from it. So have a listen, take a look, but don't ignore it. Just like any other craft, you won't know if you're making anything good until you get it out there. So don't be afraid to put yourself out and to have people listen to your music and create feedback loops, because music is a conversation and you got to give people something to talk about. This tip's for all the haters out there that still say loops and samples and presets make you phony or a fake artist. Because the reality is everybody in the industry is using them right now. And if you really, really want to know what your listener is asking, they're asking themselves whether or not your track slaps. They don't really care that you penciled in the hi-hat roll. So get in there, use some loops, use some samples, and just have fun with it. This production tip is to help you get out of your production zone, because we all know that old habits die hard. So what I tend to do is I force myself into a new DAW, or I'll start with a melody instead of a drum section. Maybe I'll write in major instead of minor. And ultimately what happens is I get into a new headspace. Although it might be more difficult, I try to push through, because I know that if I'm experimenting and failing, I'm always learning. Here's a production tip to fatten your synth sounds. Instead of reaching for an EQ to turn up the bass, try stacking octaves or a fifth above and a fourth below. This is gonna ultimately like thicken the sound and give it a more mature texture. If that's still not working, you can try adding a little distortion, which is gonna give it some more harmonic content and a little bit of saturation. And if that's still not working, at that point you might just wanna try stacking another synth sound underneath it. Here's another tip for your wild and wacky synth sounds. If you really can't get your synth sound to fit into a mix, a lot of the times it's because the sound is too out there and there's nothing that the listener can really attach to. So what you can try is using a more solid, fundamental instrument like an electronic piano or a Wurlitzer or even a classic piano, and fold that into the synth sound. That familiar harmonic structure is going to give your listener the opportunity to really like tune in and catch on to what you're trying to do, while still having this like super wacky flied texture on top of it in the synth. If you're finding your chord choices a little bland these days, I really, really suggest that you check out the chord functions that come with most DAWs these days. It's going to help you break out of the voicings you usually use and maybe come up with something that otherwise you would have never been able to play. If you're looking for that extra sweetener for your track, try using an arpeggiator to complement your chord progressions. What's really nice about an arpeggiator is you can play single notes that are going to flurry up and down that can usually create tension and resolution within your chord structure without having to overthink it. Here's a workflow tip that is sure to save your skin in an upcoming session. So a lot of the times you get halfway through a session and you've got a whole bunch of plugins and VSTs loaded up, and it's starting to get a little bit CPU intensive. So don't forget to commit, bounce, and print some of these stems out, because that way you can keep your workflow going and not have to worry about a session crashing while the artist is working. Here's a production tip for you songwriter producers out there. You think you may have a pop gem on your hands, but try demoing the same track in a different genre. After all, genres are just like colors or like outfits. So try them on, see what fits, see what looks right. You might find that that pop gem is actually a down-tempo R&B jam. So back in the day, it would have been really hard to be constantly splicing tape to move choruses and bridges and song structures around. Today, it's easier than ever, and I highly, highly recommend that if ever you're in a session and you're not feeling like the song is popping, just try and move the chorus or the hook or the pre-chorus. Maybe put the bridge in front of the second chorus to see how that's going to change things up. There's no reason that you need to have DJ in front of your name to be able to remix your own tracks. Don't get caught up in the mix details as you're creating. Generally speaking, if you spend an extra hour throughout your session doing mixing, you're probably going to go back and undo it after your creative process anyways. So start with strong sounds that already fit in your production and just keep moving forward. Here's a production tip about setting playback volume. Most people will tell you to mix quietly so you can focus on balance and have the freshest ears for the longest time. But personally, when I'm tracking, I like to track relatively loud for a couple different reasons. Number one, I can really hear any of the imperfections in the sound that need to be corrected before we continue the session. And secondly, if the sound is really irritating at the tracking volume, I know that the EQ is poor to begin with, so I'll move the mic or I'll change the instrument a little bit. I tend to mix quiet and record loud. So this is my final, most finished, last production tip for you all. Stop naming your tracks like that. Use the date and maybe even add a purpose like mix or demo or mastering session. That way you're organized and you can find that session that your client is referring to. Here's another workflow production tip for you. Set up templates for the various types of sessions you're going to run. For example, I'll have a delay that's side-chained to the vocal bus. That way it ducks when the vocalist is singing, but comes back up when they're not. This prevents me from having to route on the fly and ultimately saves me brain power throughout the session. So here's a composition trick for you producers out there. Less is always more. So try muting the tracks as you're listening back to see if the element that you've muted is really carrying or blurring the song. Because by removing these extra elements, you're gonna have a cleaner, tighter, more focused track, and you'll ultimately be able to push up the faders on the important stuff so that your track has the headroom to really make all of the elements shine the way they should. Don't resist learning music theory. Music is a language, and ultimately, the more specific you can be with your recommendations and suggestions, the healthier the discussion is in the studio session itself. So by learning a little bit of basic rhythm, you can improve your MIDI drum programming, and if you learn a bit of harmony, you'll be able to come up with stronger melodies and better chord productions for your next tracks. Do your pre-production. Make sure that you're ready to record the song before you step into the studio. It's one thing to get the gang together and to play the song in a rehearsal space and to hit all the cues. It's a whole other thing once you turn the microphones on. They're essentially going to be a microscope for all of the little hiccups and inadequacies that might be remaining in the parts. So by doing the proper pre-production, you'll be able to straighten out all those kinks and make sure that you come out with a really good track. Here's a production tip about listening in context. So instead of always soloing elements when you apply EQ or compression, remember to listen to things as a whole. Because ultimately when you mix, you're trying to glue things together, not make sure that every element sounds awesome by itself. Know when to say when. If you're still tweaking EQs and compressors and you feel like you're 99% of the way there, just stop. Because ultimately, no one's gonna be able to hear the difference. If you wanna test it, take one of your previous mix downs and put it up against your recent one and have your friend listen to it and ask them if they can hear the difference. They might say they feel something different, but generally speaking, they won't be able to pinpoint something. So just know when to say when. Hey everyone, this is Patrick at LANDR, and if you like what you just saw, consider subscribing to our channel, liking or sharing this video. And if you have more questions about production, go ahead and ask some questions in the comments below, and we'll do our best to try and answer them. Don't get demo-itis.